Week 7, Overview, the High Middle Ages. This week we reach the High Middle Ages. As a combination of religion, innovation, and feudalism brought more food, safety, and governing stability to Europe, culture began to flourish once more. The Viking raids were over. Petty squabbles had consolidated many of the European lands in France and England under a few strong leaders, and towns and trade began to spring up once again in the shadows of the great castles of Europe. During the High Middle Ages, the popes reached the height of their power. They generally prevailed in their clashes with secular rulers. Monarchs simply could not deny their authority, much as they hated losing power. Though popes and monarchs struggled for power in Europe, they also joined hands to fight a common enemy, the Turks, relatives of the Huns who had plagued Europe for 5 centuries earlier. The Turks were fierce warriors from the east who took lands from both the Arab Muslims and the Byzantine Empire. They became Muslim, but unlike the Arabs, who had generally respected Christians, the Turks were brutal to the Western pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land. Turkish hostility changed the course of history, because when they threatened Constantinople in the early 1090s, the Byzantine emperor appealed for help to the Western Pope. This was a big deal because the Eastern and Western churches had excommunicated each other a few decades earlier, in 1054. Pope Urban II called for Christian knights to sail for Palestine to save it from these unbelievers. In the years that followed, Europe launched 9 major crusades against the Turks. The Crusades and other religious issues had a long-term secular impact. The tensions between church and state shaped a number of political institutions that you'll recognize as features of our American way of life. For example, King John's surrender to Pope Innocent III played a big part in the story of the most famous document in the history of government, the Magna Carta. But to understand why, we have to start with John's big brother, Richard. Richard the Lionheart's life story weaves together many of the threads in our tapestry. He was the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, the 4th-generation Norman ruler of still mostly Saxon England. Richard took the throne in 1189 and left on the Third Crusade the next year. He took with him much of England's money and many of her best men. He was a successful crusader, but was forced to leave the Holy Land because he realized his brother, Prince John, was plotting with the King of France against him. He negotiated a truce with the Muslim leader, Saladin, and headed home. On the long march back through Europe, Richard was taken prisoner by Leopold of Austria. Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, demanded a king's ransom. Prince John offered to pay him money to not set Richard free. Despite that, English nobles paid the ransom, and Richard was set free. The King of France is reported to have warned Prince John, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." Richard was a lion-hearted man, however. When he returned, he forgave his brother, and named Prince John his heir. In just a few years, Richard died of a crossbow wound, and John took over England. John's path wasn't easy. The nobles who paid to get Richard back didn't want John as their king. Things got worse when John butted heads with the Pope. The Archbishop of Canterbury died, and John wanted one of his supporters to take the post. The monks of Canterbury chose another man, however. When both sides appealed to Pope Innocent III, he surprised all parties by rejecting both nominees in favor of his own man. This seemed outrageous to the feudal mind. The Archbishop of Canterbury was a vassal of the king, and people thought a lord had the right to choose his own vassals. King John retaliated by expelling the monks of Canterbury who had caused the problem in the first place. The Pope struck back by suspending all worship and sacraments in England. John responded by seizing church property for breaching feudal obligations. The dispute raged on. 2 years later, John was excommunicated with no result. Pope Innocent threatened worse unless the king submitted. When John finally gave in, he made the most of the situation. He offered to surrender all of England to God and Saints Peter and St. Paul. This was brilliant, in a way, but to understand why, you have to know the rest of John's troubles. Not only was John butting heads with the Pope, he had troubles with his own barons. They were willing to put up with a lot as long as the king was victorious, but John had lost his battles with the Pope and with the French across the Channel. The barons rebelled against him and demanded concessions. They met John at a meadow near London called Runnymede and forced him to sign the Great Charter, called Magna Carta in Latin. Here's where his concessions to the Church paid off. After he signed the document under duress, he appealed to the Pope to be released from such vows. Pope Innocent ruled that he wasn't obligated by a vow made under duress. The barons were outraged and invited the French to invade England. Nobody knows how long the war might have continued if John hadn't gotten sick and died. When his 9-year-old son took the throne, the barons relented, preferring to be ruled by a Norman prince rather than a French king. This was the era when all of Europe acknowledged one spiritual head and one Catholic faith. But there was a new threat on the horizon. Increased contact with the Muslim world reopened Europe to pagan classics, scrolls by thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. To understand why this was such a big deal, you need to understand how intellectually shallow Christianity had become. Men and women were devoted to God, but their devotion lacked biblical content. A few people knew enough Latin to read the Bible, if they could find one, but worship was mostly a matter of lighting candles, reciting prayers, or going on occasional pilgrimages. One did not go to church to think. The writings of the ancient philosophers rocked this world. The arguments of Plato and Aristotle dazzled the scholars of the Middle Ages, yet they routinely contradicted Scripture. That shook the simple faith of medieval man. What were Christians to do with such writings? One man uniquely deserves the credit for reconciling Christianity and the classical world, Thomas Aquinas. His great work, the Summa Theologica, attempted to systematically explain Christian theology in light of the classical writers. Thomas synthesized Christian doctrine with Aristotle's teachings. Aristotle was the master of reason, while Christianity was a matter of faith. Aquinas argued that there is no conflict between faith and reason. Faith and reason both come from God. Faith and reason both lead to truth. Any difference between what faith believes and reason thinks must come from an error in one or the other. Now, whether you agree with Aquinas on this or not, his marriage of classical and Christian thought laid the intellectual foundations for the High Middle Ages. C.S. Lewis called this one of two perfect examples of the medieval desire to build a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. The other of C.S. Lewis's examples is Dante's Divine Comedy. Your child should be reading selections from Purgatory and Paradise this week. The topic of purgatory may lead to some interesting discussions in your home. This is an area where Catholics and Protestants genuinely disagree. That's refreshing in a way. There are so many disputes that are merely semantic that it's nice every now and then to have an honest disagreement. We'll be dealing with the topic of purgatory in week 16, since it features largely in Martin Luther's objections to selling indulgences for money. If you want detail on the subject of purgatory, it's in this week's Teacher's Notes for Literature. Indulgences played a part in undermining feudalism. The popes offered indulgences to anyone who risked their life to save the Holy Land, which motivated many, but not, ultimately, enough. Pope Innocent III upped the ante. He offered an indulgence for those who paid the way for someone else to go. This changed the basic equation of feudalism. Up to now, land had been the only basis for military service. Money had seemed too mercenary a reason to fight. But with the Crusades, money changed hands instead of land. The feudal system of land, loyalty, and personal relationships began to be supplemented by a new and more efficient military system. The High Middle Ages weren't all about war, though. Your children will be learning about St. Francis of Assisi this week. Francis was born into a wealthy family in what is now Italy in 1182. He spent his youth in frivolous activities, but spent a year as a prisoner of war when he was 20. A few years after that, he began to turn his thoughts towards God. His devotion led him to renounce all personal possessions and embrace poverty in a sincere attempt at imitating Jesus. He developed a rule of life for others to follow, which was approved by Pope Innocent III in 1210. Francis went to Egypt during the Fifth Crusade to try to convert the Muslim sultan to Christ. The Franciscan monks who joined his new order had no land or property to tie them down, so they could travel freely as missionaries. They called themselves the Little Brothers of St. Francis, the Friars Minor. These wandering friars appear all over Europe in the Middle Ages, but unfortunately they weren't all as devoted to God as Francis was. By the end of the Crusades, the world we know from fairy tales and romances had taken shape. It was the age of knights errant and wandering friars, of Robin Hood and Friar Tuck and Richard the Lionheart. The amazing thing is that it isn't just a fantasy. There really were castles and crusaders. And because it wasn't a fantasy, it didn't last. The dynamics that created Christendom drove Europe on towards the Renaissance and the Reformation. We'll learn about that in Unit 2.